As someone who spent the last 10 years in Washington, it was a little bit of a longer plan than I'd intended. I had the typical, I'd spend 2 years in DC and then go back to either Chicago or Atlanta, and that plan didn't stick. It's great for me to be out here and actually hear what's on the minds of the folks who are working across the South and seeing what they see on the front lines. So you're probably asking yourself, who the heck am I and why am I here? Well, Jim mentioned that my name's Jonathan Levy and that I'm the Deputy Chief of Staff at DOE. But now, having gone through my evolution as somebody on the Hill, a couple different jobs in the administration, now I work for a brilliant man with a funny haircut. Secretary Moniz was sworn in May of last year, and at the time I didn't know him from Adam. All I knew was what came from his bio. I knew he was at MIT, he had been undersecretary at the Department of Energy during the Clinton administration, he'd served on the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology and on the Blue Ribbon Commission for America's Nuclear Future, and that was about it. I had no idea what to expect when he walked in the door as secretary. So I was more than a little surprised that one of the very first things he said to all of us was, we need to raise our game with states and local elected officials. I spent the first 2 years of my time at DOE working in the Office of Congressional and Intergovernmental Affairs, so I knew a little bit about what we did with the National Governors Association, NASIO, the US Conference of Mayors, but he made it clear that he wanted more. When the Secretary said that DOE would raise our game with the states, he meant a lot more than annual conferences and sporadic meetings. He beefed up our existing Intergovernmental Affairs Office and made it clear that the expectation was that state and local officials are partners in delivering on the Department of Energy's mission. We need to have everybody in on the takeoff if we want to have them in on the landing. That's been one of his guiding philosophies from day one. He insisted on adding a deputy for state and local affairs in our policy office, and he wanted to stay close to innovation happening at the non-federal level. And he told every assistant secretary that they had a responsibility to engage directly with the states. And he was very clear as to why. The secretary told all of us at the department that he came back to DOE for 4 main reasons, and yes, he often cracked the joke about it's like a second marriage, the triumph of hope over experience. He said he came back for 4 main reasons: to address climate change through an all-of-the-above energy strategy, to advance nuclear security, both in terms of keeping the stockpile safe and reliable without testing, as well as addressing global proliferation risks, to improve the management of the department itself, especially in the area of cleaning up legacy waste sites around the country, and to keep America at the forefront of science in areas like supercomputing. These are all, to paraphrase the Vice President, big freaking deals. And without exception, the department cannot deliver on them without partnering with states to confront our most serious energy, climate, and national security challenges. The Secretary recognizes that you are our partners in terms of policy and innovation partnerships, and beyond that as well. Just take a look at where the Department of Energy has its facilities. The region in the Southern States Energy Board represents 4 national labs, all of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve sites, 3 of the key sites for the nuclear weapons production complex, service territory for 2 power marketing administrations. It's home to huge environmental cleanup missions, one of the National Network of Manufacturing Institute selections in North Carolina, hundreds of clean energy grant recipients, and many of the places where thousands of DOE employees go to work every day. No matter which prong of the department's mission, as the Secretary calls them, weapons, windmills, quarks, and quagmires, you can find all of them in the South. The South is all of the above for the Department of Energy, and it is all of the above in terms of energy production for the country. And an all of the above energy strategy is key to addressing climate change. The Secretary has said a number of times that all of the above is not just a slogan. It is a pathway to creating jobs and at the same time reducing carbon emissions, which recently stood at their lowest level in 20 years. Now, I recognize that there are divergent views about climate change around this room today, and I appreciate Jim getting some folks to put tomatoes away by noting I'm not from the EPA. But the Secretary has said many times, he's not and I'm not here to debate what's not debatable. Climate change is happening, and it's a threat multiplier. As a White House report issued earlier this year noted, the effects of climate change are already being felt across the nation. In the past 3 decades, the percentage of Americans with asthma has more than doubled. The impacts of extreme weather events, from more severe droughts and wildfires to more powerful hurricanes and record heat waves, are hitting communities across the country. These changes come with far-reaching consequences and real economic costs. In a speech last week, Treasury Secretary Jack Lew noted that, as an economic matter, the cost of inaction or delay is far greater than the cost of inaction. The Council of Economic Advisors estimates that if warming above pre-industrial levels increases to 3 degrees Celsius instead of 2, there would be a 1% decrease in global output annually. That is not small potatoes, we're talking about GDP. The economic cost of climate change is not limited to one sector of our economy. It threatens our agricultural productivity, our transportation infrastructure, and power grids, and drives up the incidence of costly healthcare problems. Accordingly, inaction on climate change is not an option. Now, as for what to do about it, that's where there's room for healthy debate. We in the administration believe in taking an all-of-the-above approach to addressing climate change. The President has announced a climate action plan to cut the carbon pollution that causes climate change and impacts public health. As you know, and we heard many allusions to today, the EPA has announced plans to address carbon pollution from power plants, and I know while there has been some disagreement about it, there is a tremendous amount of flexibility among states in how to meet it, including one thing that's often overlooked, which is the ability for different states to partner with neighboring states to form regional standards to meet different targets. Now, at the Department of Energy, we are not a major regulatory agency, but we do offer technical assistance to states interested in information about energy efficiency, renewable resource availability, federal financing assistance, and more. That technical assistance can include comparing different ways to reach GHG targets. I would encourage all of you and your staffs to take a look at www.energy.gov/technical assistance for further details, and I'm happy to share that with anyone who's interested. The Department of Energy at its core is a technology agency. Our predecessor agencies grew out of the Manhattan Project, and we have been focused on energy security since our official founding as DOE in October of 1977. Our main role then in addressing climate change is to partner with industry, academia, and the national labs to lower the cost of all the innovative technologies that can help achieve the vision of a low-carbon future. Yes, people immediately think of solar and wind energy when we talk about clean energy, and we have seen tremendous progress in renewable deployments. The nation has more than doubled renewable electricity generation over the last 5 years, and the cost reductions in solar, wind, and geothermal technologies have been remarkable, and we will continue to drive down those costs. But the Department of Energy is also making significant investments in clean fossil fuel technology through both grants and the Clean Coal Power Initiative and the $8 billion in loan guarantees that we recently made available for advanced fossil fuel technologies. We also support nuclear technology like the small modular reactor designs we're helping fund and the loan guarantees for the 2 new Vogtle nuclear reactors in Georgia. And hopefully all of you are aware of the work we do directly with states, ranging from the weatherization program and grants through the state energy program. Let's also not forget the history behind the Department of Energy's support for unconventional natural gas production. In the 1970s, the majors just weren't interested, and the independent oil and gas companies couldn't invest on the scale and risk basis needed for what was then unproven horizontal drilling techniques. Through grants and tax credits, DOE's Office of Fossil Energy partnered with the Gas Research Institute in an innovative public-private partnership to demonstrate this technology that has enabled the shale gas revolution that we heard Governor Tomblin and others reference earlier today. All of these technologies, nuclear, advanced fossil, renewables, and energy efficiency, all of them are critical to addressing climate change and advancing our economy. And it just so happens that the South is showing the rest of the country and the world that they do work. I think it's fitting that this year's SSEB title is Regional Leadership, Global Influence. When it comes to clean energy, this is a global race. Countries around the world are battling to invent the batteries, solar panels, and advanced fossil technologies that will be sold all over the world. This is a multi-billion-dollar market that we're all competing for. And the US is not the only country that recognizes that moving to a low-carbon economy is a win for the environment, the economy, and national security. The South really is leading the way, and you're already doing it through the same all-of-the-above approach that we've been talking about here and that people like Governor Fallon have addressed at her recent energy conference. Now, when I say all of the above, I don't mean that every single state will have every single technology. I do mean, though, that there is a suite of technology options to choose from, and we're seeing them ramp up all over the South. Georgia and North Carolina have ramped up their solar power capacity. Texas has the most installed wind capacity in the country, and Mississippi is home to the Kemper Clean Coal Project, just to name a few. We're seeing the first new nuclear reactors under construction for the first time in over 30 years, including the 2 in Georgia I mentioned that were supported by DOE loan guarantees, 2 in South Carolina at Sumner, and the new Watts Bar facility at TVA that's just months away. I'm hoping weeks, actually. There is biomass capacity in nearly every state in the South, with tremendous examples like the commercial-scale waste-to-ethanol plant and an algae-to-ethanol pilot plant in Florida. And Georgia actually has the 5th highest per capita electric vehicle ownership in the country. And we can't forget energy efficiency generally. Every watt saved not only reduces the need for additional capital expenditures to install peaking capacity, but it also represents real dollars saved by consumers and economic opportunities for the men and women doing energy efficiency retrofits or manufacturing the new energy efficient technologies that we use today. Plus, demand response technology has other benefits. We heard from one of Southern Company's subsidiaries today, and I'd like to just take a minute to highlight the work they're doing on smart grid technology. In talking to some of their folks in DC, they noted that when they have a storm, whether it's a hurricane or a tornado, thanks to the demand response and smart grid technology they've installed, they don't have to go neighborhood by neighborhood to check and see who's out. They can tell house by house, meter by meter, which not only saves time for restoration, it potentially saves lives in dangerous events where things are too hot or too cold. So while some states could choose to do all of these, some could take a combination: natural gas combined cycle, biopower and nuclear, or some people could go and lean on clean coal, wind, and solar. What's important is that the South has it all. Each state has a menu of technologies to choose from if they want to lead in a clean energy economy. The states that are leading right now recognize that clean energy is a way to drive economic growth and prosperity in your states. We heard earlier that these are economic decisions for the wind purchases and the solar purchases, and they're smart economic decisions going forward in a robust, balanced portfolio for reliability and diversity. So now to go back to my earlier question, who the heck am I and why am I here? I'm here because this is where all of the above is happening. I'm here because this is how we'll lead as a country. And I'm here because Secretary Moniz wants to make sure that there is a strong federal partner for the South and other states and other regions around the country as you lead the way to prosper in a clean energy economy. I alluded earlier to our state energy program, and we use that to provide annual formula funds, and we also provide additional competitive grant solicitations for those funds. Last year, Alabama, Arkansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, and Tennessee all received funding through the competitive program. And we're actually really close. Next month, we're going to announce the selections for this year's awardees. So hopefully that's one more reason to drive you guys to the DOE's website. But this is more than, it's not just about money. It's about more than that, and it's about more than the technical assistance we can make available to state and local governments. This is about the states represented here leading the charge for American energy security in a low-carbon world. We want to work together to build and deploy clean energy technologies in the South and sell them all over the world. The South is already off to a great start, and if there's anything that DOE can do, please give us a call. With that, thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take questions. I didn't think this crowd was going to be shy.
Well, I'll do the first one.
The icebreaker?
I'll do the icebreaker. We have a microphone? It doesn't matter.
Here.
Could you talk a little bit about the President's Quadrennial Energy Review? It's received quite a bit of attention, and give us an idea as to where it's going and what's the first phase going to be.
Sure. So one of the unique things about having Secretary Moniz as our secretary is he'd previously, as I mentioned, been undersecretary in the Clinton administration. He'd been in the OSTP, the Office of Science Technology Policy Advisors, and more recently he was on the Presidential Council of Advisors on Science and Technology Policy, PCAST. PCAST made a recommendation to the President that we needed a quadrennial energy review. Folks may realize that the Department of Defense does a quadrennial defense review, a QDR, and says, what are our needs over the next 4 years? It's a way to take a slightly longer term view. Now, 4 years isn't as long as many people would like, given the scale of investments needed for a lot of energy issues. But we decided we needed to take a stab at it. So right now, we are working on the first installment of the Quadrennial Energy Review. We're focusing on infrastructure. We've had a series of public meetings all across the country trying to get input, and it's largely a document to do analysis to figure out what the needs are, where do we need to be going as a country on transmission, distribution, generation assets, the infrastructure that binds us together as a country. And we're actually very excited about the opportunities that we'll have working with states, working with local folks, and figuring out where we can go to modernize and move forward, particularly in areas like the grid, where we all know we need to make some serious investments.
Any other questions? Well, I have a second one if that helps. Southern State Energy Board works with the national laboratories, Oak Ridge, NETL, Savannah River, Lawrence Livermore, come to mind. And they're proud of the relationships that they have with those national laboratories. Do you see a prospect for additional work, or what do you see for the labs?
Oh, look, I think the labs are a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous tool for the department. For those that are not familiar, we have 17 national labs. Jim named a few of them. We have several in New Mexico. The ones that I was alluding to in the South are the Thomas Jefferson Lab, Savannah River National Lab, Oak Ridge, and NETL, which I mentioned earlier and almost forgot again. Morgantown. And obviously we have an NETL office in Pittsburgh. Morgantown's the anchor branch there. There's a lot of different opportunities that states and folks around the country can work with the labs. Some of it is as simple as, NREL has renewable resource assessments. Some of it is the technical assistance they can do in some studies on grid integration or other things. If there is an energy issue that you are looking for more data, more analysis on, you would be surprised what you can find in the labs. PNNL up in the Pacific Northwest does a tremendous amount on cybersecurity. Grid resilience and defending ourselves from cyber attacks is something that I think all of us have seen heightened awareness on over the last few years. And we can provide some technical resources as well as some guidance connecting with other folks in the industry to share best practices on things like best ways to do well casings for natural gas, for production in the shale. There's a lot of different ways that we've got technology options and some insight from experts in the labs that we are happy to share and love to work with states and other folks as partners on.
I think a lot of the states are not necessarily aware of the resources that the labs have to offer. In the past, it used to be difficult for the states to do work with the national labs, but it wasn't an entree. Now I understand that DOE has a easier access to them.
This is one of those things that Secretary Moniz made a big priority. How do we make sure that the national labs realize that it's not just about the department's mission, which is obviously critical, but seeing what other users need to be, have demands that need to be met. We have user facilities that are as simple as the light sources and different technology sources that pharmaceutical companies and other folks use, but then there's the resources we can provide to policymakers and to technology companies and people that are advancing the ball on some of the clean energy technologies out there.
Any questions?
Please. Talk a little bit about used nuclear fuel and where all that is going and what we're doing about the national repository. We know that there was a blue ribbon group last year and so forth, and yet we don't hear very much about what's happening and where it's going in terms of a repository.
Sure.
And we know we have some states, even in this region, that could be interested in it if it was the right kind of a setup. And so I'd just like to hear a little bit more about where you're going.
Sure. Well, one of the first things that we've recognized from the history of the nuclear waste disposal process, and one of the key recommendations that came out of the Blue Ribbon Commission, is that we have to have a consent-based siting process. Part of the problem with what happened with the Nuclear Waste Policy Act is, or as it was informally known by folks in the region, it was the Screw Nevada bill. And so no one wants to repeat history and go through a situation where someone is forced, a state or a locality is forced to be the national repository. Additionally, there were some recommendations about interim storage site or sites, that you might need more than one. All of this is kind of the stepping to the point where we need to be able to have some new legislation. So the Secretary has worked actually very directly and very personally with a bipartisan group of senators to try and work through legislation to amend the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Unfortunately, as was kind of alluded to in the morning sessions, there's not a lot going on in terms of legislation getting done in Congress right now. So there's a couple things that we can do as a department through executive action. Some is some additional research on transporting. Some is some additional things that we're going to do on the R&D basis to make sure that we're ready. But the bottom line is that we need to move forward with a consent-based process so that we can have a fresh path. And I think you're right that there are states that will step forward and say, you know what, this is an economic proposition. We've seen that happen in a couple places in Europe where you actually had multiple regions competing to be the repository. And that's a much better situation to be in than one where you say, hey, city X or county X, you have to take this stuff. I think I saw a hand that was starting to pop up over here.
Yeah, there's portions of our electric grid that's over a century old and has been demonstrated by several natural disasters, very vulnerable. And then there was an attack 2013 out in California by a very well organized, supposedly military style, that nearly took out the electricity for Silicon Valley. And I'm curious if DOE has done an analysis on upgrading and changing our grid outside of the quote-unquote smart grid.
Right. So actually the physical attacks have been a really interesting and terrifying piece of emphasis for us. People have been thinking about it in terms of modernization, in terms of cybersecurity, and the incident you're referring to, and actually a couple of other ones that are less known, have brought back to the forefront the need for hardening, for increased security, for actually a supply chain resiliency where you have to figure out, okay, if this transformer goes down, how long does it take to get the next one? The Department of Energy quarterly convenes meetings of what's called the ESCC, the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council. Boring acronym, but the bottom line is that you're talking about CEOs of utilities and industry groups like the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. These folks come together at the CEO level with the Deputy Secretary of Energy, talk about sharing best practices. We share intelligence with them in terms of getting some temporary clearances to CEOs so they can know the nature of the threat, what they need to do to actually mitigate the threat. And we actually have one of those meetings coming up in October, and they've been a productive exchange of ideas. In some of the Superstorm Sandy contexts and the wake of natural disasters, we also did a lot of work coordinating between federal, state, local, and utility partners to figure out what folks needed. Did we need to airlift some things out from the West Coast? Did we need to move workers? How could we do it? Do we need to waive different federal regulations so that trucks could get to different parts of the country to meet those responses? Part of the problem is that the Department of Energy has a lot of responsibility for securing energy infrastructure, but the vast majority of the assets are held in private hands. Fortunately, folks like CEO Tom Fanning from Southern Company, folks like the Edison Electric Institute, they've been tremendous partners in recognizing the need to move forward with sharing information without running afoul of FTC standards or anything like that, but getting in a position where we can do response and we can do restoration very quickly and figure out what we can do on the resilience side, both from natural disasters as well as physical attacks.
Any more questions?
Jim, I think there's one down here.
I have a question. I'm glad to see that you're not from the EPA. But you know, we hear you say a lot about wanting to work with our states. Does the Department of Energy, do they have any influence over the EPA if you all would tell them how that their regulations are hurting our coal-fired plants? Is there any way that you can work with the EPA in toning it down, given its time?
So as I mentioned, we're not a large regulatory agency. Our main role, as far as whether it's regulatory analysis or things like that, is in technical assistance. So one of the things that we do is if an individual state wants to say, hey, we know what the target is, how could we meet it, we can help with that. If the EPA wants data on what reliability looks like, what projections are for deployment of different fleets going forward, we can share some of that information, but we are constrained and we are not in a position to tell the EPA what to do. It's an independent regulatory agency.
I guess just one question. It's been mentioned several times today. We've talked about the cold winter we had, the cold snap, as the former speaker earlier today talked about. But what are we doing to protect our grid in this country? I think that's one of those things that as a governor, I'm very concerned about. That back in January we were just about ready, as I understand, for the grid to break down in the northeast, and we had 10 of the plants that are being closed down, our peaker plants, so they were running above 90%. Those will not be online this year. It's getting into extremely cold or extremely hot temperatures. We could very well be facing many thousands of people, in a desperate situation, not having the heat or the cool they need in those severe times.
Right. So obviously the first principle is that safety is paramount. We want to make sure that folks are not in a situation where their health or their lives are in danger. As John was alluding to, we have a situation where the grid is very, very old. Former Secretary Chu used to talk about the fact that if Edison came back, he'd be able to recognize the grid, and that's not a good thing. So on the one hand, we definitely have work we need to do to modernize that grid, make it more resilient, make it better connected, better with demand response. Now that ties into the second point, which is what do you do on the generation side, making sure that you have the reliability to meet the needs that you have. In a lot of ways, energy efficiency is a big part of that play, because as I mentioned earlier and has been stated by a lot of different folks in the utility industry, when you're looking at energy efficiency, in a lot of ways it's a business proposition. The peakers that you install, you're installing only to meet certain peaks of demand, and if you can actually flatten that demand out, do some things with your response, do some things with integration of other sources, you can keep a stable base so that you can make sure that folks are safe and you provide that reliability. There's a lot of work that continues to need to be done. We're working very closely with our utility partners to make sure that they have the resources they need to provide heat and cooling in those critical times of the year.
Question back there.
I've worked at the Hammer Halloween nuclear plant in Missouri for 15 years. We are just now filling up our wet storage, so we're starting to move to dry cask storage. You talked about a federal or regional repository. What about reprocessing? Does the DOE have an opinion on reprocessing of used nuclear fuel today, other than what Jimmy Carter had?
So the federal government, the federal policy on reprocessing has not changed much in a very long time, as you allude to. I think part of it is the concern, and a very strong and reasonable concern, about fissile material and proliferation on the back end. A lot of folks point to the French experience. They use a technology that's called Purex reprocessing. The issue with that is that it's actually not that difficult to tinker on the back end and have some fairly violent or virulent strains of plutonium that we're very concerned about from a proliferation perspective. That continues to be a major concern for us and is one of our key mission areas. That's a guiding principle, that we are not open to technology pathways that are going to open up proliferation risks in a way that could be harmful to national security. Now, that being said, we're doing all sorts of R&D on advanced reactor concepts. We're interested in looking at all sorts of elements of what we can do on a research basis to advance nuclear technology. Some of that includes some fuel cycle R&D. At this point, the policy still remains that we are going through the once-through cycle. There are some folks out there that have talked about a semi-closed loop, if you will, and there's a bunch of different technology pathways that people are looking into, but as of right now, it's largely the same.
Any additional questions?
Well, if I may, thank you very much again to Jim, to the governor, to Ken, to everybody here for inviting me down to this wonderful conference and for being tremendous partners. I do hope that you will take me up on the offer of, if there is anything that on a state basis you guys need, that you do reach out to us. We do have a policy office that's dedicated to state and local engagement. We have an intergovernmental and external affairs office, and obviously we have a tremendous resource in Jim, who is liaising directly with the department on a weekly and daily basis. So again, thank you very much for your time, and I do hope that we can go forward as partners.